All right, welcome everybody to Starting Seedlings. I am Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education here at Seed St. Louis. So first, just because we got a lot of people and it's the first class of the year, just some quick information about who we are or why you should listen to us, I guess, or why we have any information that's worth listening to. So we are Seed St. Louis. We are a support organization whose purpose is to provide the community with education, resources, and a network to grow their own food. So we currently support actually, that's a little outdated. We currently support a network of about 250 projects across the region. And this map shows you kind of the general layout of where those projects are. So these are primarily community and school, garden, and orchards. So we're working with community groups that want to grow their own food. And we provide lots of different services, which you can all see listed here. But part of that, of those services, is that some of them, which are designed for those groups, are also beneficial to the broader community, and it's not any more work on our part to do that. Things like classes, it doesn't take me any more work to talk to more people than to fewer people. So we open them up to everybody and they're free. And so hopefully they're beneficial to everyone out there. So then getting into the material here. So I always like to start out my classes, if you've been to any of my classes, just by defining a little bit to make sure we're all on the same page. Because I find, especially in gardening, a lot of people will use different words to mean the same thing, and it can get confusing. So when we're talking about seedlings, which is what we're talking about, growing seedlings today, the way that we are defining that for this class is a seedling is a young plant that is grown from seed. So for the purposes of this class, specifically one that you are growing in a controlled environment, so usually like climate controlled, that you're watering in a pot, something like that, in order to transplant somewhere else or at a later date. We are generally not, we're not going to be talking about things that are propagated by cuttings or vegetatively. There's not a whole lot of plants that we do that with in the vegetable garden. We do that with things like potatoes, sweet potatoes. Like there are a few things, but mostly we're growing things from seed in the vegetable garden. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So why grow seedlings? I imagine you all have your reasons, which is why you're here. But just some of the kind of benefits of growing seedlings is that you can get an earlier start. So this is, versus planting it directly in the ground. The benefits could be you can get an earlier start, which can mean an earlier harvest. So especially for things like, tomatoes that they take a long time when they're little, like they're relatively slow growing when they're small. And they still, take until kind of midsummer to start producing fruit, versus if you direct seed them in the ground, most of them aren't going to start producing fruit until like August. So you get just a much longer harvest by the nature of getting the plant growing earlier in the year if you're growing it as a seedling. You can also, in that same vein, you can get a longer and or larger harvest by doing seedlings for some of those plants. One of the reasons that I do seedlings a lot of time is that, especially if you're growing a plant that is new to you, growing in pots inside, in a very controlled environment, can be a really great way to learn what in the world this plant looks like. Because, when you direct seed something outside and you're not sure what you're looking for, a lot of times it can be confusing where you're like, is that the plant? Is that a weed? I don't know. Versus if you're doing it in a pot, it can be much easier to be like, that's where I put the seed. It's right in the middle. It's growing. There shouldn't be a whole lot of weeds, or really any weeds, growing in the potting mixes that you're using. And so it's a good way to kind of learn what your plants look like if it's a plant that you're unfamiliar with. It's also a way to increase your chances of success with plants that are slow growing or have a low germination rate. So again, this is particularly the case if you have a lot of weeds in your garden, like if you have a lot of weed pressure with where you're gardening. Planting things in pots that are really slow when they're young can be a good way to help kind of deal with that issue, because plants that are really slow growing can get swamped by weeds pretty quickly. It's also a great way to conserve rare seeds. If you have a seed that you just don't have that many of, or was really expensive, or the seed packet was really small, or whatever reason that you don't have a lot of seed, growing a seedling can be a way to make sure that you're going to get a higher percentage of those seeds becoming plants, because you're able to control that youngest part of its life, which is when they're the most delicate and susceptible to, you know, pests and weeds and all the different problems that plants can run into. It can also help with succession planting. So if you're wanting to grow stuff in, spring, summer, and fall, it can be nice to have a place where you're growing seedlings so that the season before can grow a little longer. So, if you're wanting to grow, I don't know, something in the summer, but you also want to grow a fall thing in that space, you can let the summer thing grow longer if you're growing the fall crop in a pot and then you're putting it out versus having to rip the summer thing out, 4 weeks earlier to direct seed. And also if you have melons can be a little tricky in our heavy soils and they can germinate a little better in pots sometimes. So why not to grow seedlings? This is a big thing that I always like to emphasize to people. So I'll say, if you go to a lot of nurseries, they will sell seedlings of anything. And the primary reason they do that is not necessarily because seedlings are better. It's because they make more money off seedlings. You can sell a seedling for a lot more than seeds. And so if people will buy them, they're going to sell them. But there's a lot of things that it just doesn't really make sense to do as seedlings. So some of the reasons why you would not grow seedlings is it isn't necessary or helpful. So large seeded things, so things like squash, cucumbers, beans, peas, corn, okra, generally you don't get really any benefit from growing as seedlings in terms of faster growth or anything like that. So you just might not want to do that. You can direct seed those pretty easily. They do pretty well. Also, when plants don't like to be transplanted, a lot of root crops don't really like being transplanted. Things like carrots or beets, it can be done. I know people who do it, but generally speaking, they do better just direct seeded into the ground. Or if you just don't want to or aren't able to, if you don't have the right setup, if you don't have the time, there's very few plants that will not work direct seeded in the ground. It's pretty much things like onions, Brussels sprouts, eggplants, and peppers are just about the only things that absolutely will not work direct seeded in the ground. So you don't have to do seedlings. But if you're wanting to grow seedlings, which again, I assume you do because you're here, these are the ones that we find are the ones that it's really worth doing as seedlings, as opposed to direct seeding in the ground, that you get a real benefit from doing them as seedlings. So a lot of your brassicas, so, the collards, kale, cabbage, kohlrabi, bok choy, tatsoi, all of those do well as seedlings. It's really beneficial. The same with solanaceous crops, so things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, tomatillos, ground cherries, the onion family, onions and leeks, and most of your herbs, not all of them. And then I have a little asterisk there that those ones with the asterisks, if you're gonna do from seed, you definitely want to do them in pots as opposed to in the ground, or at least it's way easier doing it that way. But the ones with asterisks also tend to be pretty easy to just do as divisions from existing plants, or digging one up versus trying to direct seed them. So what you'll actually need if you want to start seeds, and we'll talk about a couple different options as we go through, but generally speaking, what you're going to need is seeds. You'll need a seed starting medium, so that's what we're calling kind of like the soil that you would be using, but you're not using the same soil you'd put in your garden, so it's usually called a seed starting medium. You're also going to need something for holding the plants, so usually those would be pots, but there's a couple different options. You'll want some sort of tray to catch water that are coming out of the bottom of the pots, because your pots should have drainage holes in them. You will need a source of light. You will need some sort of source of fertility. And then a couple optional things that can be really helpful if there's certain plants that you're wanting to grow are things like heat mats and humidity domes, which we'll talk about what all of that means. So seed starting medium, this is one of the things that I think is the most important that often gets overlooked with growing seeds. I will say, there's a lot of stuff out there that's just like, oh, use this or that, or just potting mix or whatever. And I have seen people grow seedlings in just about anything. But if you are wanting to know, I'm going to get good seedlings pretty reliably, you really want a good seed starting mix, which again, we'll talk about what that specifically means. But you really want a good seed starting mix There are things like peat pellets, which is what these are over here, that you can get that are like a type of seed starting mix that are in like a weird little pellet thing. Or you can make your own seed starting mix. But again, generally speaking, we are not talking about digging dirt up out of your garden or buying a bag of topsoil or buying a bag of even potting mix, generally speaking. Because you do not really want garden soil, because seed starting mix is for the most part going to be much lighter, which is going to help those seedling roots get growing much faster. It's going to be much more free draining. That lighter, fluffier texture is going to let water flow through more quickly, which is going to do a couple things. One, it's going to mean that you can water it more often to keep the soil surface wet without having the bottom soggy all the time. Which is helpful because your seedling roots are really short when they start out because they're coming out of a little tiny seed. So that free draining helps with that. And because you're usually inside, which does not have as much, direct sun and airflow and things like that as outside, that soil is outside is going to dry out much more quickly than it is inside. And so you can run into issues with root rot and fungus gnats and all sorts of disease and pest issues if you're using really heavy soils that are wet all the time inside. And seed starting mixes just really help with avoiding those issues. They are also usually sterile, which means a couple things. It means that one, there's no disease organisms in there, and it also means there's no weed seeds. So again, if you're like, I'm not sure what this little plant looks like, if you're using a seed starting mix, the only thing that will be growing in there is the thing that you planted. There are no other seeds in there. So it can really help if you're unfamiliar with what you're growing. Most of the seed starting mixes that you will find, and potting mixes for that matter, most of the seed starting mixes are based on peat. And I'm going to talk about why I don't like peat. But before I do, I will say we actually have a lot of peat-based seed starting mix for sale, really, really cheap right now. We were able to get some that was going to get thrown in a landfill, diverted to us instead. And so we're selling it really cheap. So we'll talk about why I don't like peat, but it does work for seed starting really well. So if you're looking for a cheap option that's available, we have a lot. But the problem with peat, or why I don't recommend going out and buying peat, generally speaking, is a couple things. One, it necessitates the adding of a wetting agent and is very acidic. Neither of those things are inherently bad, but they are just like additional things that make it more difficult if you want to make your own blend. If you're buying, a seed starting mix, the company that made it has already dealt with those issues and you don't need to worry about it. But if you're trying to make your own, peat can be a really annoying thing to deal with. The big reason why we don't love it is that peat bogs are actually an enormous carbon sink. And the harvesting of peat is releasing enormous quantities of greenhouse gases, as well as destroying those ecosystems. So peat bogs cover 3% of the world's land surface, and then they currently hold 30% of all soil carbon on the planet, which is more than all the living plant life in the world combined. So it's an enormous amount of carbon in a very small amount of space, and the damaging of peat bogs and harvesting it to make potting mix and whatnot is one of the ways that happens, is leading to large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, which are equal to 6% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions we are releasing. This hasn't been talked about a lot recently because there really weren't a lot of good alternatives for horticulture, but there now are. So let's talk about it. There's a lot of places that claim that Canadian peat harvesting might be sustainable, but it's a little, I don't know. They claim it's sustainable, but I don't know. I still don't like it because it's also just not great because of its acidity issues. The wetting agent, so that's if you've ever had a potted plant and it dries out and then it's like you pour water on it and it just doesn't absorb water. That's because there's peat in it. Peat actually doesn't want to be wet. Once it dries out, it's really hard to get it wet again. If you use things other than peat, you don't have that problem. And if it dries out, you can just water it and it will absorb water like soil is supposed to. So some alternatives, which are ones that we like, that if you're able to find, like if you're out looking for stuff or you want to make your own seed starting mix, some alternative things you can use. Probably the one that is the most tested and is kind of the most equivalent to peat is a product called coir or core or coconut husk. It's got a lot of different names. It's a waste product of coconut farming. It is sold loose, like in the picture here, but it can also be compressed into bricks, where you'll get like literally like a brick that you put into a 5-gallon bucket and add water, and it puffs up to like 5 gallons worth of material, which is nice in terms of shipping. It's more sustainable for shipping. They can also make it and have started making it into pellets. So instead of peat pellets, there's now coir pellets. There's coir pots and coir trays, just like there's peat pots and peat trays. It's an agricultural waste product, which is nice. It absorbs water, unlike peat, and it's not acidic, unlike peat. So you don't need to deal with those issues if you're trying to make your own. And it's just really kind of the best one-for-one replacement. We've also been doing some experimenting recently with bark products. So there's a product called Pine Fines, which is this picture on the right, which you can see looks pretty similar. That is a waste product of mulch processing. And the mulch processing is a waste product of the timber industry. So it's a waste product of a waste product that seems to work pretty well. We don't have enough experience to like recommend it wholesale, but if you're wanting to experiment with it, you can get some. They're called Pine Fines, like PINE space FINES. You can get them by the truckload from St. Louis Composting for relatively cheap for the amount that you get. And there are a few companies that have started making like potting mixes that have pine fines in them. It's usually called forest waste products is usually what they call it on bags. I know Fox Farm has a couple, although all of those still have at least some peat added in. If you want to make your own, you can do that. I've been making my own for quite a while. This is the recipe that I use. This is all by volume, not by weight. So, I'll get like a little scoop of whatever size I want, and then I'll do 2 scoops of coir puffed up like this. So this is the brick on the right. I wet it, turns into this over here in the middle. Like 2 scoops of that, stick it in a tub or a bucket. Then I do 1 scoop of compost. And when I say industrial compost, I mean like the stuff from the city or the stuff from St. Louis Composting, the stuff that's like made on a massive scale with big machines is actually better because it's very sterile versus the stuff that you make in your compost at home probably has weed seeds because your temperature is almost certainly not getting high enough to kill them. And if it is, you should probably be a little worried because you might have a spontaneous compost fire if they're getting that hot. But generally speaking, your temperature is not going to get that high. So your compost can have weed seeds, it can have disease organisms and stuff like that, which is fine for your garden, but not ideal for seed starting. So if you're able to get some of that compost, and we have, you look on the City of St. Louis's forestry website. If you're in the city, there's free city compost available at I think 9 different pickup locations in the city. And then I do 1 part of either perlite or rice hulls. I like rice hulls more because again, it's like a waste product, but they're pretty hard to find. Perlite is really easy to find and is not unsustainable. But I like that rice hulls are a waste product. And then I add a granular slow release fertilizer. There's lots of them out there. They all probably work. The one that I use is usually the one that we sell, which is called Green Soil Solutions, which is made in St. Louis. But I've also used, like Osmocote. I've used just random garden granular fertilizers that somebody gave me. They all kind of work. Then you're also going to need something to hold that seed starting mix that you have. So usually that's going to be, a pot. First thing is that whatever container you use has to have drainage holes. You don't want to be using a teacup or something that you can't have a drainage hole in. It's possible to do that, but it's very, very easy to overwater. And that's where you're going to start getting root rot and stuff, even with that seed starting mix. Because if it's free draining, but then it just pools at the bottom, it's not actually free draining. So you want your container to have drainage holes at the bottom. A couple options other than like pots, like you can get plastic pots, which is the most common thing that's used. And I'll talk about that's what I use, and I'll talk about why, even though I hate plastic. You can use pellets, So I talked about kind of those peat pellets before. This is a picture down here of them puffed up. So a lot of people like those because they're like, oh, they don't have plastic, and they advertise that you can just like stick them right in the ground. Except they don't tell you, even though like you can look it up, the netting on the outside is plastic, and so it like degrades, but it doesn't actually like decompose. Like, so unless you like rip that netting off, which is really annoying. Like, I've tried to do it, it's really annoying. But unless you're doing that, you're just burying plastic in your garden. But you can use those if you're going to do them. Again, I would recommend the coir pellets, just because peat is not great. You can also make your own pots. So there's lots of instructions online where you can use like newspaper, you can use toilet paper rolls. I did that for several years. You can use egg cartons, yogurt containers, eggshells. You can use lots of different stuff. But if you're wanting to do any significant amount, it's usually easier to have some sort of pot or tray as opposed to like eggshells. Those are hard, they're small. Egg cartons also pretty small. There's not a lot of space for roots, but it can be done. There's also quote unquote biodegradable pots. There's peat, which isn't actually really biodegradable. It's actually like pre-coal. It's kind of like a weird transition between organic material and fossil fuel. So it does kind of break down, but mostly if you've ever buried a peat pot in the ground, you probably noticed that that peat pot is still there in a year or two. It just kind of maybe breaks into smaller pieces as you rip it apart. But it's not like poisonous. So so they do sell those peat pots. They do now make coir pots, which break down a little better. And they even make cow poop pots that look exactly like coir. It's like washed, sterilized cow poop. So it's mostly fiber. It looks exactly like coir pots, except it's made from dairy poop. So those also work. With all of those, though, I recommend still taking it out of the pot. Don't leave it in the pot. They say you can do that. It just doesn't work very well. You can take the pot off and then throw it in your compost, and it will kind of break up as you turn stuff, but the roots are going to have a hard time poking out of those pots for the most part. You can also do soil blocks. So this is where you completely skip having a pot, actually. It's a way to smash soil into its own pot. So this is a picture that I took here. I think it was just yesterday at the Science Center. That they set up this little demo for me to take some pictures and give it a try. But you need this nifty little tool here to do that. And you're using a seed starting mix. If you want to do soil blocks, it's usually a heavier mix. Most of them are, again, peat based, but you're usually going to use a heavier mix because you need to compress it enough that it's going to stay together. They seem to still do well. I think the reason that they still do well is because they have so much air around, like, because there's no pots, like all of these areas can dry out. So even though it's heavier and is holding water more than a conventional seed starting mix, because there's airflow all around it, they seem to still work. So for these, you can actually use like a conventional potting mix. Seems to work pretty well for that. But that's another option, but you need this special tool for that. And then you're going to need a tray. So you're going to need something to put those pots in, or those soil blocks in, or even the pellets in. Like, there's just something that's got to be in. Generally something that's going to hold water. And there's a lot of things that you can like reuse. So you can buy trays. So that's what these are down here. These are called what's the official name? I mean, they're called flats. I can't remember. They've got an official name, like 1020 flats, I think, something like that. They're 10 inches by 20 inches. I think they're called 1020 flats. But this is what you'll see at a lot of nurseries that like the pots are in. It's a pretty standard thing. You can get them. They're nice if you're able to find them, but you can also use like an old cookie sheet or an old cake pan. Works really well. Or go to Goodwill and find an old cake pan. You can even use plates, but these nice square ones are nicer than round things because you can line them up and they're a little bit more space efficient. So I'll say my kind of preferred setup, or the setup that I use, just to give you an example of kind of different things you can use, is I do use plastic pots or inserts. So you can also get like this picture here on the left. You can get these like trays where these are all attached. So it's like one big sheet, but it's, broken into individual cells, they're usually called. So I use a lot of these. Then for like stuff that I'm growing that I want to get really big for whatever reason, I'll use a pot like this. But I mostly use these because I was able to find some. Most of the containers that I use are recycled ones. They're reused ones. I don't like buying plastic, and especially these trays. A lot of them, they're available. People buy plants. They come in pots. They don't know what to do with them. So if you're able to find that, or any other gardeners out there, you can collect some pots maybe. And the flats, having the thing in the flats. So the reason that we're recommending them is that, one, it helps catch the water. And also for some things like these trays over here, there's not even a bottom to these pots. It's completely open. So if it's not in this tray, all the soil is just going to fall out as you try and move them around. So the flats make it much easier to carry and move and reorganize things, which is going to come in handy later in the process that we'll talk about. But just generally is nice as you're trying to move stuff around, water stuff. Having flats is much easier than having like 100 individual pots that all are moving of their own volition. I then put, because these trays that I have actually still have drainage holes on them, but like water can still actually come through these flats that I have. So what I then have underneath them is another tray that is waterproof that I can put multiple flats onto, and it also allows me to move multiple flats at once up and down shelves or around. And the best thing that I found for that is dog crate pans, like those like wire dog cages. If you go to like a pet store or like a farm and home store kind of thing, they sell those like wire dog crates. And in the bottom of those, there's usually like a big black plastic tray that you put at the bottom of that. They're really heavy duty, and there's at least this one size that I found that's 20 inches wide and is about 30 inches long, which is basically enough for three standard flats, which is really nice. So the pros of the plastic and the setup, and one of the reasons why I go with it, is that very easy to wash. Plastic is easy to wash, as opposed to like, it's pretty hard to like reuse peat pots. Like you're having to rebuy those peat pots every year. So you can wash them, which is nice. They're stackable, so you can stack them, which is much easier to store when you're not growing seedlings. And they're easy to replace. They're pretty standard sizes. Like if you stick with those standard sizes, and again, a lot of them, they're out there. If you're in the gardening realm, other people, like when you're buying plants, they're coming in those pots a lot of times. So if you just are reusing them, it can be easy to kind of replace as they break or as you need more, or if you lose them or whatever. You are also going to need light. So this is kind of one of the other big things that I see a lot of times with growing seedlings, is you'll find all sorts of people that are like, just put it in a sunny window. And that, I guess, could work. I have not had much luck with it here in St. Louis, and I haven't met many people who have. Again, I'm sure it's possible. But if your seedlings do not get enough intense light, that's what causes legginess. When your plants get really long and stretched, that's a lack of light. That's what is primarily causing that. So if you've ever had that issue with your seedlings, it's because you didn't have enough light. And here in St. Louis, a window is rarely enough because our days are very short, and a lot of our winter days are very cloudy. It wasn't very bright today. If you had a plant in a window, it's not going to be getting enough light. It's very cloudy, and the days are very short. The plants are just not going to be happy. So if you really want to grow high quality seedlings, you really need artificial lighting. So really any light will do. You can get a grow light. There are grow lights. They're very nice. Your plants will grow faster. They will look gorgeous, but they can be pretty expensive. But just a standard old light will also be enough to grow a decent seedling. They're just going to grow a little slower. They might not look quite as beautiful and healthy, but they will be fine with just any artificial lighting. Probably the most popular and the one that's kind of the easiest to find is like an old shop light, like LED tube lights, or not LED, sorry. Fluorescent tube lights are probably the easiest to find. If you are using a fluorescent light, they should be very close to your plants to get enough light, like 2 to 4 inches from the top of the plant, very close. If you are using LEDs, they should be further away. LEDs are much more intense, and you'll find like each light should tell you kind of the distance, especially if you're dealing with LED grow lights specifically, is what I'm talking about. They should be further away because they're very intense. They can burn the plants. Fluorescents will only do that if they're like pretty much touching the plant, and that's from like the heat of the fluorescent light will literally burn the plant, versus LEDs, just the intensity of the light can scorch the leaves. So LEDs are a little further away, but if you're dealing with just like any old fluorescent light, like 2 to 4 inches, like really close. If it's further away than that, you're still going to be seeing some legginess as they're stretching toward that light. And you can get LED tubes now for fluorescent light fixtures. So you can do that. I just threw a fun fact in here because I just found it out like a year ago that the guy who invented LEDs grew up like down the street from me. Didn't know that. Glen Carbon, Illinois, just across the river. And because that distance that you are working, that the light needs to be from your plant is growing. So, if it's only 2 inches away and your plant is growing, it's going to eventually run into that light. So it is very helpful to have a way to lift your lights up as you go. So having like a shelf, especially if you're growing more than just a few seedlings. If you're growing just a few seedlings, you can just use a lamp, doesn't matter. But if you're growing like a lot of seedlings, it can be helpful to kind of have a shelf, and then you can tie one light to the shelf above it with like some sort of rope or chain or something that you can shorten to move up. And that's going to be the way to get the best, healthiest seedlings that are not going to be leggy. Fertility is another thing that you need to keep in mind. Seed starting mix, like a seed starting mix that you buy from the store, generally does not have compost in it, generally does not have any nutrients at all. And so if you plant something just into straight seed starting mix or like a peat pellet has zero nutritional value to a plant. Absolutely none. So if you plant something in a peat pellet and just water it, it'll grow for a week or two, and then it's probably going to turn yellow, and then it's probably going to die because there's no nutrients. So you are going to need to fertilize probably. If you're making your own seed starting mix, if you have one that has compost in it, that compost is going to help. It's going to provide some nutrition to your plants, but it is still usually helpful to add some sort of fertilizer. My preferred way to do it is to do a granular fertilizer into the mix. So if I'm mixing my own, the recipe that I talked about at the beginning, I mixed in a granular fertilizer. If you buy seed starting mix, you can throw a granular fertilizer in and mix it in before you do that. I would say, generally speaking, you want like a very slow release one, like not a like 10-10-10 lawn fertilizer, like none of that business. Like a slow release garden fertilizer, because that's going to prevent burning. And then follow the instructions on the back, like for whatever it would say for potted plants. That's what you want to follow, and do not overdo it. If you overdo it with fertilizer, especially if you're using any synthetic fertilizers, it will kill your plants even faster than not fertilizing them at all. So follow the instructions. They are important. So you can do the granular fertilizer. I like the granular fertilizers because it means I don't have to remember to do liquid fertilizers all the time. But you can also do a liquid fertilizer, or you can do both. Sometimes I'll mix in a granular fertilizer, and then if I notice, the plants still look a little sad, I'll do a liquid fertilizer on top of that. But generally speaking, granular fertilizers, much easier to do. Liquid fertilizers, you can also just add them directly to your water as you're watering them. It's called fertigation. Fun little word. So you just add it into your water, and then you just, as you're watering your plants, you're also fertilizing them. In terms of organic options, if you're not wanting to do synthetic fertilizers, mineral organic fertilizers tend to be nicer than what I would call like biological ones. So biological ones would be things like fish emulsions or blood meal or, I don't like manure. Like those are generally not nice for seed starting because you're probably doing seed starting in your house. And you probably don't want your house to smell like blood, poop, and liquefied fish. And so a lot of organic fertilizers have those types of things in them. So if you're looking for a fertilizer for your in-home seed starting, it's usually best to avoid, especially the fish. They actually do make some granular fertilizers that do have kind of manure fertility and blood fertility in them that are not stinky. But again, they're like pelletized granular fertilizers. The liquid ones all smell pretty nasty. But there are like liquid organic mineral ones. So those are things where they're getting like a mineral form of nitrogen, a mineral form of phosphorus, and because it's like dug out of the ground, it's considered organic, and it's not smelly because it's a rock. So that is usually what I would recommend, just because again, liquefied fish, just generally not a great idea inside your house. A couple optional things that can be helpful, especially with certain plants, is a heat mat. So heat mats, again, are not essential, but they can speed up germination. Your plants will sprout more quickly. And this can be particularly helpful if you keep your home cool in the winter. You know, if you keep the furnace relatively low to save some money and your house is cold, the plants are going to germinate more slowly. And especially if you're trying to grow things that want to grow in the summer, like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, things that like it hot. If you're trying to grow it in your house that's pretty cool, they're going to be very slow to sprout. Peppers and eggplants in particular, I generally say a heat mat is almost a must unless your house is really warm. Heat mat is really, really, really going to increase your success with peppers and eggplants. And then domes. So domes are literally just a cover that you put over your pots, your tray, to hold humidity in. If you're using a heat mat, it also helps keep it a little warmer in there because the heat is, being transferred to the water, which is getting trapped, which is dropping down. So it helps keep it even warmer than if there was not a dome over it. So it helps keep the humidity high, which helps speed germination. And it helps keep the heat in, which can help speed germination. It only really holds the heat in, again, if you have a heat mat. Seeds don't produce their own heat, so putting it over top is not going to insulate it in any way. Yeah, and you can usually find them very cheap, or just make your own. Put some plastic wrap over it, or put something over the top of it. So when to start seedlings? This can always get a little tricky, or is one of the big questions that people always have. A lot of seed packets, they should tell you on the back. Like if it's from like a nice seed company, they should tell you. But we also have this calendar that we've made. This is the old image. There's a 2023 one now. It's very similar. But this is up on our website all the time. I think it's right on our homepage. You can just go to seedstl.org and look this up, and it will show you when we recommend starting seedlings. So that's what this little like potted plant image is tells you when we recommend you start all these different things as a seedling if you're wanting to transplant it outside. And then when you transplant it is where the little green trowel is. So the green little plant and then the green little trowel is when you would start a seedling and when you would transplant it outside. So this is a nice little chart that we made. We use it and we do update it every year. Not a whole lot changes every year, but there are changes happening. So we do update it every year. So then just kind of a rundown of the process. So those are like, all the different things you need, but to kind of put it into context of like what it actually looks like. It's not as crazy as it sounds. So you first want to prepare your items. So generally I, will set up my lights, my shelf. So I have a shelf specifically that I set up and tear down every year. So you like set up the shelf, or if you have one already and maybe you have a spot and you have the lights and the shelf set up all the time, and that's great. Or if you're, smaller scale and you're just like doing it on a table or something, find your light, get it there, whatever you need to do, set up your space. Then if you are going to be reusing pots, it's good to wash them. Especially if you had any disease issues in those potted things, like if last year you were growing and your seedlings got disease or something like that, you definitely want to be washing those pots like with soap and water and maybe bleach to make sure that you're killing any of those diseases that might be in there. If you didn't have disease issues, it's still best practice to wash them. I would say I hose them out. I'm not like usually scrubbing them with soap and bleach and stuff, but that is technically the best practice. So, but if you had noticeable disease problems or you had problems, definitely do that. Like it's worth your time, or just throw those pots out and get some more if that's your thing. So clean the pots, get them ready, and then mix your seed starting mix. If you're making your own, mix it together. Make sure to add your granular fertilizer if you're mixing your own, or if you're buying one from the store, if you're going to go the granular fertilizer route, which again, I would recommend. And then moisten your seed starting mix. So usually when you get a seed starting mix, or if you're making your own, it's pretty dry. You want it wet before it goes in the pot, especially if it is a peat-based seed starting mix. If you put a dry peat-based seed starting mix in a pot and then try and water it, it is not a fun day. Moisten it before it goes in the pot. Generally, the way that I do that is you put it like in a bucket or a big Rubbermaid tub or whatever, depending on how much you have, and then pour water into it. And then you can just let it sit sometimes, or if it's peat, a lot of times you need to like knead it, to like force the water into it, like knead it like you're kneading dough, like to literally like massage the water into it, and it will eventually get wet. Kind of the moisture level that you're looking for if you're wanting to like plant your seeds right away. Usually kind of the ideal moisture level is about the seed starting mix should be about the consistency and moisture level of like a cake batter. So it should be, wet, but not like, shouldn't be like pancake. Like it shouldn't be like real wet. It shouldn't be like mud. Like but it should be moist enough. Yeah. You might need to knead it. And then fill your pots. So fill it up. I usually recommend to when you fill the pot, to then kind of just tap it on the table, like just if you have the table, just take the pot and just kind of like drop it, just kind of hit the bottom a time or two, and it's gonna settle quite a bit, and then add more to fill the top, and then put it in your tray. Because as you water it that first time, if you don't do that, it's gonna settle a lot, and then your pot's gonna be kind of empty. So do that, and then put your pots onto your trays, and then plant your seeds. The general rule for planting seeds is that you don't want to plant them any deeper than twice the diameter of the seed. So, if you've got like a little tiny broccoli seed, don't put it an inch down. That's way too deep. So most seeds do not need to be very deep at all. If you think about it in nature, no seed is getting 2 inches below the soil surface. How would that even happen? Most of them are just falling on the soil surface. A lot of the burying of the seeds that we do is just to help speed germination because they stay wet longer. And most seeds do need darkness, but not all of them. So some of them, so bury them. Again, most good seed companies should have that information on the back of the seed packet, like how deep to plant it. But I find that a lot of times people err on the side of deeper, and that's the opposite. You should always do shallower. Like if you're debating between how deep to do it, do shallower. Deeper is never the option, or is never the best choice on seeds. So you want to do them relatively shallow. For very tiny seeds, things like lettuce or like celery, or some things that have like really small seeds, just literally sprinkle them on the soil surface, because especially with the nice fluffy seed starting mix you have, when you water it, it's gonna go into the soil. Don't try and bury those; they're too small. You're always gonna do it too deep. Just sprinkle it right on the soil surface, and your life will be much easier. And then, and I can't stress this enough, label the seedlings with whatever information you want, like whether it's just cauliflower or broccoli, or if you have like a specific variety, like if you have 2 varieties of broccoli, label those varieties, because you cannot tell the difference once they germinate. Unless you're a magician, I can't do it. And a lot of the crops that we grow look very similar, or like quite literally identical when they're young. Like our brassicas, like cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, collards, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, those are all literally the same species. So when they're young, they look exactly the same. So label your plant. You might think you will remember, and maybe you will, but I can almost assure you, you won't. The number of times that I have planted seedlings and then basically been like, I don't have any idea what this is. I don't know where to plant it. I don't know the spacing. I don't know, because I don't know what it is. It's very frustrating. So label your plant. And then water your seeds. As soon as you plant them, give them a nice water. You want a gentle water. You don't want to be like dumping like a big like stream of water onto them, because again, this seed starting mix is very light and fluffy, which you want, but it also means if you dump a big heavy stream of water on it, it's just going to wash it out, and along with the seed and everything. So generally what I find is the best, especially until the plants get going. If you have a small number of seedlings that you're doing, just like a spray bottle, like that you just put water in and like mist the top, or what I use is a big pump sprayer, like the stuff that they use to like spray herbicide and stuff. Buy a new one, don't reuse one, and just use that. It's great. It's much easier on the hand. And I water like hundreds of seedlings a year using that. And I use that for watering pretty much the whole time I'm growing seedlings. And then again, if you're doing a liquid fertilizer, you can put that straight in with the water, and then you're watering and fertilizing at the same time. But a pump sprayer like this, I have tried a couple different ways to water, and I really, really like using a pump sprayer. It's much easier. And it's very gentle on the plants, which is nice, especially when they're very tiny. It's very helpful. Then you want to put your trays under your grow lights. You do not need to turn on the lights until after the seeds have sprouted. But as soon as the seeds have sprouted, like within a day, you want to turn the lights on. Because if you don't, if they're up and there's no light on, they're going to start stretching to try and find light, and they're going to start getting leggy. So, but you don't need the light on until they germinate, because they don't need light. But as soon as they germinate, turn that light on. If you're going to use a heat mat, put the heat mat under the tray, like when you plant the seed. So like as soon as the seed is planted, you water it, stick the tray under, turn it on, because that heat mat is particularly helpful with getting them to sprout. So you want that when you want them to sprout. And then if you're going to use a dome, put that on as well, because again, that helps mostly with germination. Pretty much as soon as the seeds sprout, you want to remove that humidity dome, because the plant is then going to be wet all the time, which is going to encourage disease and stuff like that, which we don't want. So really the dome and the heat mat are both to get germination going. So those are things that you do right at the beginning, but kind of once germination has happened, you want to take the dome off pretty much immediately. The heat mat you can leave on the whole time, but the big benefit is when they're first germinating, and then the first, couple days, week or two, that they're growing is where you get the most benefit from a heat mat. So I know people too, if you've only got one heat mat and you want to grow multiple trays, you can, stick it under a tray, seed it, get it to germinate. And then once they germinate, move that tray off the heat mat, seed another one, stick it on the heat mat, and do your thing. And then just like your ongoing maintenance, like the stuff that you're going to need to do, you're going to need to water. There's not like a good formula for how often you need to water, because it depends on how big the plant is, what kind of seed starting mix you used, how much airflow you have, what the temperature in your house is, whether you're using a heat mat or not. I can't give you a like once a day, this amount of water, but basically just as often as needed to keep the medium surface moist when you're trying to get germination. So when you plant the seed, like before the thing has germinated, and then when it's still really tiny, you want that soil surface to pretty much be moist kind of all the time. Usually you can do that with once or maybe 2 waterings a day when they're really little. Once the plants get a little bigger, once they have 3-4 leaves on them, you don't need to be as picky about it. Usually like once a day at that point is enough watering. But you really want to make sure that soil surface is staying moist when you're trying to get your plants to germinate, because again, the seed is just right below the soil surface. So if the surface is dry, it means the seed is dry. And if the seed is dry, it's not going to germinate. So it's really important when they're young. And that's where like the humidity dome can help with that, because it helps keep that soil surface wet during germination. You're also going to need to be doing fertilizing. If you did not have the granular fertilizer, especially. If you did not have the granular fertilizer, if you did not use that, you will need to start doing a liquid fertilizer as soon as what they call the first true leaves grow. So, when you're growing plants, a lot of times, it'll pop up and there's these 2 little leaves that like come up immediately. And then, maybe a week later, you get, 1 leaf that pops up that looks different. So that one leaf that pops up that looks different, that's the true leaf, it's called. So those first two little leaves, those, it doesn't matter. They're not called true leaves, but you don't really need to fertilize at that point. But once you start getting that third leaf coming up, you want to start fertilizing. You don't want to fertilize any more often than every other day, but generally speaking, you shouldn't need to do a liquid fertilizer more than like once a week, maybe twice a week. But again, follow the instructions on the fertilizer, whatever fertilizer you're using. For the lighting that you're using, it should be on 12 to 16 hours a day. If you do less than 12 hours a day, you're not going to get anywhere near as much growth. And you don't want to have them on 24 hours a day because plants actually have a circadian rhythm. And if it's on 24 hours a day, it also will mess up their growing. They don't grow as well if it's on 24 hours a day. And because of that same fact that they have this like circadian rhythm thing going on, it's usually best to have them on pretty much the same hours every day. Like, doesn't need to be exact, but it's not good if you have them like, oh, I have them on in the morning today, and I have them on in the middle of the night tomorrow, and I have them on in the afternoon the day after that. Like that can also mess with plants. So you can get just like a timer on your lights so that it just is on and off and you don't have to think about it. Or what I often do is just when I get up first thing in the morning, I turn them on. Right before I go to bed at night, I turn them off. And that's usually about 16 hours because in an ideal world, I sleep 8 hours. It's also good to have airflow. So because of the high moisture that you're having, because you're watering all the time, and the low airflow that we generally have inside, you can have disease and gnat problems. So having some additional airflow, like if you have a fan to kind of blow that over the plants, can be helpful, but is not essential. Or if you can like set up your seedlings kind of under a vent, that can be your airflow for you. That's what I do, and it works pretty well. And then a thing called agitation, especially if you do not have a fan blowing on your seedlings all the time as they're growing, just literally rubbing your hand over the top of your seedlings, like I'm doing in this picture here, will actually trigger them to produce stronger stems. If they're inside where there's no wind, there's nothing bumping into them, they don't feel that they need the energy, that they need to take the energy to make a stronger stem, and so they don't. And so then when you put it outside and it is windy and stuff's bumping into them, they just flop over. And so you want to kind of strengthen those stems, which is just, again, like you water them, you literally just kind of rub them a little bit, just with your hand, just kind of rub it back and forth. Don't be like real aggressive with it, but like, bend them, do that. And just doing that, once a day or whenever you're taking care of your seedlings is going to strengthen those stems so that they're much more resilient when you get them outside. And then thinning. So generally when you're seeding your trays, I should have mentioned this earlier, you will probably put, 2 or 3 seeds per pot. Because if you put just one seed, if it doesn't germinate, then you have one without a plant in it. And so if you plant 2 or 3, then you know that at least one is going to germinate, usually, unless your seed is bad. And so a lot of times you'll get more than one that will germinate. You'll get 2. If you plant 3, you might get 2, or you might get all 3 that'll germinate. But you only want one per pot or per cell. And so you want to remove those other ones. The time to do that is when the first true leaf is just emerging. That's when you're like, all right, they're doing okay, I can remove the other ones. So this is an example here. So this is a kale plant. So you can see there's these 2 leaves that pop up first, and then there's this third one that's coming up that looks more like a kale leaf. So since that, is coming out, it's like, all right, it's time to remove the others. And you can see this little green stump here. There's another one right here. So there were 3 that were planted here. All 3 germinated. We only wanted 1. So once this one had its first kind of true leaf on there, we cut the other 2. We don't pull them out because if you do that, you run the risk of uprooting the one that you want to save, or just damaging the roots of the one that you want to save. And so you just cut them, just get just little scissors or whatever, just snip them, or even with your fingers. A lot of time you can pinch them with your nails and they'll cut off. When they're really young like this, they're very tender. You can just snip those off, and then you'll leave just that one to get nice and big and healthy. So then when is it time to plant? When it's time. So check your planting calendar to know kind of when is a good time to do it. And the main importance of the planting calendar is you don't want to do it too early. If you do it too early, even if you're like, oh, it seems like it's nice outside, it probably is, but St. Louis's weather is incredibly unpredictable and we have big, ups and downs. It was 70 degrees a couple days ago and it's supposed to be, I don't know, 20 or 19 tomorrow night, at least out in the outside of the city areas. So I mean, you just never know what's going to happen. So following a calendar is usually a good way to kind of tampen your over enthusiasm that we all have in the spring, to make sure you're not planting too early. It's also good to wait until they are at least big enough. Generally, you want at least 4 true leaves. So again, when we talk about kind of the true leaves, so that looks something like this. So this is a cabbage. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a big enough size. They can get a little bigger, but this is like big enough that if you stick it out, it's going to be fine. It's robust enough. It's healthy enough that you should be good. If it's like the calendar says it's time to plant, but your seedlings are still too small, it's worth it to keep growing them to get a little bigger before you put them outside. So again, it's better to be a little later than a little earlier. Best to be right on time, but that's not how life works. You'll also find some people talk about up potting. So up potting is just where you're moving it from one pot to a bigger pot. You do not have to up pot. If you plant your seedlings in big enough pots from day one, you never need to up pot. But if you plant things in little itty bitty pots to start with, and you want to have it, like tomatoes is like a classic thing where people will start their tomatoes really early and they'll want these big giant tomatoes to like stick out in the ground. Well, if you do that, yeah, you're going to need to move that plant to bigger pots over time because you probably don't want to start your seed in a giant pot to start out with, although you could. But you don't have to up pot. You'll hear people talk about like, oh, you need to up pot the tomatoes and do all this. You don't have to do that as long as you start in a decent sized pot that is big enough. But if you start your seedlings too early or they're too healthy or whatever, or our weather is particularly weird and you need to wait longer to plant something outside, if your plants are getting restricted in your pots, if they're like smashing into each other and getting leggy because there's just not enough space, and it's like, oh, it's still way too cold, it's going to be at least a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before I can plant them outside, it can be really beneficial to up pot them if you're going to keep them inside, just because it will keep them growing vigorously, so that when you can finally get them outside, they'll be kind of in their healthiest state. But again, you don't have to do up potting. And then the last step is hardening off. So this is another critical thing that if you are growing your own seedlings, a lot of times people will forget. This is done by nurseries for you, which is why a lot of times people don't know to do it unless you're growing your own. But again, if your plants are inside all the time, their life is really cushy. It's why we spend so much time, energy, and money making inside for ourselves. It's much easier than being outside. And if you're taking this little baby plant who has lived inside its whole life and then you just throw it outside one day and you're like, figure it out, a lot of times they're going to die, or they're going to be very stressed, or they're not going to grow very much. They're going to have like really big transplant shock. So hardening off is simply the name for the process of slowly getting them used to being outside. So for generally about a week before transplanting them outside, you want to bring the seedlings outside for a couple hours, and then bring them back inside. And then the next day, bring them outside for a couple more hours than the day before, and then bring them back inside. And you do that until by kind of like the last day, they're outside, 24 hours. And then the next day you can stick them in the ground. This is not like a solid formula that doesn't work for everyone. If you're not like working from home or something, it's pretty hard to just be like, oh, I'll do a couple more hours today. If the weather is particularly nice outside, like if it's, ideal spring weather and basically the temperature outside is the same as inside, you can just put them outside. But you want to do that in their pot for at least a couple days before you then stick them in the ground, because the sticking in the ground is a shock and the temperature change is a shock. So if the temperature is really nice outside and you need to be more like, oh, I'll put them out in the morning before I go to work and then I'll bring them back in when I get home, so it's not like the slow ramp up. If you have a couple days where it's pretty nice, at least do that for a couple days and then have them outside for 24 hours in a pot and then stick them in the ground. And that is it for seed starting. I see there's a lot of questions, and we will get to those. But these are just some of our upcoming classes that hopefully will interest at least some of you. And that is it.